There's kangaroos.
And
Nobody's murdering each
surfing
other.
and giant spiders. Like, people are too concerned with the giant insects than trying to kill each other, you know? Hi, I'm Chansey.
And I'm Lila.
And this is For Criming Out Loud.
So this week I heard this crazy story. It was all over the news, so most of you guys probably heard it too. But there is a woman that got stabbed to death in Walmart in California.
Oh my gosh. Like in the
Yeah,
Walmart.
like in Walmart. She's a Walmart employee. And what ended up happening is like she was like 65 years old. She'd worked at Walmart for like 25 years. And she just randomly got stabbed to death by this guy that was like on parole.
Why did he stab her? Was it just like for
There's like
kicks?
no reason. No. And what ended up happening is he like technically he like got away with it. Like they didn't know who did it. They only had a description that it was of like what he looked like. And then he went and turned himself into the police later.
So he could have got away with it. They wouldn't have known who he was.
He was only like in jail first for like armed robbery, and then he just like stabbed this woman to death like multiple times, multiple stab wounds to death in the middle of a Walmart with like onlookers. He just like
He just lost it.
killed her. Yeah,
Just
it
went
was. I'm like,
crazy.
can you imagine walking through Walmart and then it's just like somebody's like stabbing somebody to death? I mean, that's wild.
It's wild to
Obviously
me that he
wild.
they didn't know what his face looked like because Walmart has so many security cameras. I don't
Yeah, I
understand
don't
how he
know.
got out of there without his face being shown.
And
That's
maybe they
weird.
did, but they didn't like specifically say that. They said they were going off like descriptions of eyewitnesses and like the I read like just 3 news articles on it, but they didn't mention having like video footage of him or anything.
Dang, a
So
Walmart. You
yeah,
know, this is why I
it's
do
really
Walmart
sad.
pickup. I don't go into the store.
Anyway, so there you have it. There's
That's pretty crazy.
watch your back in Walmart, folks, because I guess you never know who's
Literally.
in there.
That's true. Everybody in the world shops at Walmart, even serial killers.
I guess so.
So, actually, there's a
Yeah, that's creepy
case
to think about.
with a serial killer who actually his like MO was stealing credit cards and like off of his victims after he killed them and then using them. And he got caught because he used a Walmart credit card at a self checkout line, and they have cameras in the self checkout thingies.
Yeah.
And so it like pinged that he was using the card, and they also got his face at the same time. And so they caught him. It's like, go Walmart. Got a serial killer.
Go Walmart. Yeah, but also like what a stupid thing to do. Like would you not
Oh yeah,
what if
what a
they, what
dummy.
if people think like that camera isn't there for you? Like I know you can see yourself, but it's
It's not a
not just
mirror.
there just for you to yeah. That's funny. Okay.
It's not meant to help you like figure out if you look hot enough to leave the Walmart. That's not what it's
Yep.
for.
No.
But apparently
Walmart for
that
the
guy
win and
thought
the
it was.
lose.
Yeah. They won for the serial killer. I don't think it's a win that somebody just got stabbed in their store and nobody even knew about it or what to
Yeah,
do.
well, I mean they
But
knew about it, but what do you like it was too
I
late
guess
once
what do
people
you
got
do?
there. You call
Like somebody just
911, but
randomly, yeah, like by the time it's over and he's running.
yeah, within like two
Well,
minutes. Yeah,
at least he turned himself in. It could have been like worse. It could have been, I don't know, why would you do that?
I don't know.
Because you're maybe he had like a scrap of a soul left.
Some people thought that the reason he committed the crime was just because he was like on drugs. And
I mean,
basically
that seems
was,
pretty
yeah.
likely.
I saw a picture of him and I was like, very possible. Yeah.
He looks like he's a
So,
little rough. He's going through some rough stuff. And he took it out on a helpless woman in a store like monsters do. So, well,
yeah, there you have it.
that is
There's your little
freaking
news
crazy.
bit of the week.
Some true crime news for y'all. My case that we're covering today is not anywhere near that recent. Didn't happen last week. It actually happened in it happened in 1960. So I feel like I have a thing with the 60s and 70s because I covered the Zodiac last week or last time I did an episode, and that was in the 60s as well. So here we are again. We're actually covering our first ever Australian case today. We're heading
Wow.
to the outback. So that'll
The
be fun.
Outback.
The
I wish I had a
outback.
good Australian accent right now, but I don't.
I have
I almost
zero.
just said
And
accent instead of
accent.
accent.
Yeah. This case is actually like a really famous Australian case. I had never heard this case before, but apparently in Australia it's pretty well known. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what the Google said.
I feel like I've only ever heard like one Australian case ever, period.
Really?
So I'm
I feel
excited
like
to hear
I've
a new
heard
one.
like a lot of Australian cases. I feel like the true crime world has kind of an obsession with Australia.
Really? Maybe I just don't
But
pay attention though. But I swear I can think of one in specific, and I'm sure there's more, but I guess I can only remember one.
I
So
think for me, some of the Australian cases have like stuck out for some reason more. Like I can think of 3 or 4 that I'm like, that's crazy that
well,
happened.
what's funny to me is it's like I'm like aware of crime in our country and certain countries, like it doesn't surprise me if I hear about somebody brutally murdered in like Mexico, right? Like not surprised.
Yeah.
But there's certain areas of the world that for some reason you're just like nobody murders anybody there. Australia is one of those places. You're like,
It's just
no,
like paradise.
it's the land of the like the chill. There's kangaroos.
And
Nobody's murdering each
surfing
other.
and giant spiders. Like people are too concerned with the giant insects than trying to kill each other, you know? Like that's what I'd be concerned with. Keeping all
Yeah,
those
exactly.
giant bugs out of my
And
house.
they literally like we have like a friend from Australia and they literally like hunt kangaroos because they're like rodents there. There's too many of
They're
them.
like infestations, yeah. And it's
So
the only
instead of like
place on the
people
planet
going,
that they're native.
yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, so just a wild place that you don't think people get murdered. That's what I always think of.
Truly. Truly. Unless apparently it's kangaroos. Apparently they get killed a lot.
They
But
do. They get murdered.
that's a totally different thing. Okay, so this case was actually the first of its kind ever in Australian history. So this had never ever happened before in Australia before this case. So I think that's kind of why it's kind of a well-known thing in Australia because this was like the numero uno. Anyways, so today we're talking about what happened to a boy named Graeme Thorne. In July of 1960, there was an Australian traveling salesman who was named Basil Thorne. There's a lot of really good names in this, by the way. Just everybody prep yourselves because it's pretty cool. There was a guy named Basil Thorne. He was a traveling salesman and he won the Sydney Opera House lottery in 1960.
Whoa, that's a
So,
lot of
yeah.
money, especially in 1960.
Well, it's actually about $2.5 million in now currency. Back then, it was like 100,000 pounds, but it was like a lot of
Okay,
money. The kind of money
got
that
it.
changes people's lives when they're traveling salesmen, you know?
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, so in July of 1960, he wins the lottery and he's super excited because now he has all this money for him and his little family. He lived with his wife, Freda, and also with his son, Graham, who was 8, and his daughter, Belinda, who was 3. And they lived in just like a little suburb of Sydney, Australia called Bondi. and they were just like super excited. Who wouldn't be excited to win almost $3 million
Oh yeah.
in the
No,
lottery?
that'd be wonderful.
And so Basil's windfall became like an instant sensation in the news. People were like, this down on his luck, not super wealthy guy just won the lottery. He was front page news for like weeks. And it would continue much longer, not just because of the lottery. But in the article about him winning this lottery prize, there were like pictures of him and details about him and his family and like where they lived that probably should have been kept private, but weren't because it's 1960 and people just assume people are good people, you know?
Oh
And
boy.
so his address was just like published in the newspaper. So everybody knew where this guy lived.
Oh.
And
Why would
they
anybody do
also,
that?
yeah, right? You'd think that that would just be like common sense, but I think it's just ingrained into us now. 80 years
Not
later, we're
even
like,
not even for safety purposes, but just for like privacy purposes. Not everybody
yeah,
needs to
you
know
don't
where you live. You don't need to be harassed by people all the time.
exactly. And now every down on their luck person is going to come knocking at his door and be like, hey, you just won almost a lot of money. You should give me some because I'm in
Mm-hmm.
need. You know, that just is, I
Yeah.
just feel like that's just not the kind of thing you should do. This newspaper didn't seem to have those qualms. So they just went ahead and not only did they do that, not only did they put his address out there, they also put the exact date that he was receiving the prize money from the lottery. So they're like,
Great.
he's going to get it in 5 days on July 7th. And I was like, why? Why would you put that information? Whatever. Anyway, so they did that. And after winning the lottery, he just decided to live in his same little duplex where he lived with his family. So the family just continued to live their normal life, just doing their regular thing. They were living in a brick duplex in Bondi and just kind of like living life. And on July 7th of 1960, the day that Basil was going to get his prize money from the lottery, they were just kind of going about their regular lives. Basil was out of town for work. And like I said, he was a traveling salesman, so that wasn't weird. He was just like doing his thing. Freda was home with their 3-year-old, and Graeme was on his way to school. And every morning, Graeme was picked up by a family friend, like at a corner that was like 300 meters or like less than a quarter mile from his house. So he like walked to the corner and then waited for his family friend to come pick him up and take him to school. And so on this day, he was just doing his normal routine. He went to the corner. On this day, he decided to go into the corner store and he bought a little packet of chips to eat while he was waiting. And then he went back outside and he was just waiting for his ride. And this was around 8:30 a.m. when that's his normal time that he goes and stands on the corner. At 8:40 a.m., 10 minutes after Graeme left his house, the Thorne's family friend, who was named Phyllis Smith, she pulled up to the corner to pick Graeme up. And this was at the corner of Wellington and O'Brien. And this was their usual spot. She was expecting to see him there, and she couldn't find him. She was like, what's going on? He's usually here. Maybe he decided to stay home. So she just drives down the street and stops at his house and talks to his mom, Freda. And she's like, hey, like, is Graeme coming to school today? Do I need to pick him up? Like, what's going on? And Freda's like, oh, he left 10 minutes ago, so he must have gotten to school some other way. Like, he
Oh
should
boy.
already be there. So Phyllis, she gets back in her car, she drops her kids off at school, and because she's like a super mom or something, she decides to check with the school and make sure that Graham's there. And so she checks, and Graham is not there. He never
Oh
arrived.
no.
And so she immediately turns around and goes back to Frida, and she's like, something's wrong. Graham's not at school. And so at this point, Frida's like fully freaking out, and she calls the police and reports
Remind
him
me, how
missing.
old is he?
He's 8 years old.
He's an 8-year-old. And
Yep.
She's reported him missing. That's so scary.
She's fully freaking out. And I actually read somewhere, because she's not really mentioned for the rest of the case, Freda. She like apparently was sedated or something because she was freaking out. I don't know if that was like a typical
Whoa.
1960 practice to just like sedate people when they got hysterical or whatever, but
That's
that's what I
intense.
saw in a couple news articles, was that they had like she was sedated and not available for any sort of like questioning. So
Gee.
that was interesting. So after she called the police responded very quickly because, like I said, this was the first time that this had ever happened. Like kids go missing, but not very often, and so they took it very seriously right off the bat, and they began immediately like searching and investigating, and there was definitely like a sense of urgency behind all of their actions. So police arrived at the Thorne residence at like 9:40 a.m., which was like literally like an hour and 10 minutes after Graeme left their home that morning. So they were pretty quick responding. And while they were there, like right after they got there, their the Thorne family phone like rang, and Freda answered it. And it was a man with a foreign accent, and immediately one of the police sergeants took the phone and started acting like Basil Thorne because Basil was out of town. He wasn't there. And so this police
Hmm.
officer pretended that he was Graham's father.
Smart.
And the kidnapper said, quote, "I have your boy. I want 25,000 pounds before 5 o'clock this afternoon. I'm not fooling. If I don't get the money before 5 o'clock, I'll feed the boy to the sharks." End quote. So obviously, this is a kidnap for ransom situation, which like literally has never happened with a child in Australia before this point. So police are
Wow.
like,
That's impressive.
I know, right? 1960, I feel like that's pretty late in the game for not having like a any sort of child for ransom situation. But it's good for Australia. It also meant that they were a little bit like, what do we do here?
What do we do now? This is why they shouldn't have told people where these people live. Because of
Yeah,
course some stupid poo poo head was gonna be like, I'm gonna go take advantage of these people.
exactly. Of
So that
course.
sucks.
That's just what people do. It's shocking to me that they were like, let's just post all this stuff in the newspaper. It's great.
Australia, they believe a little too much in
They
people.
believed in
People
people
aren't that good.
just a little much. So after the kidnapper said this, the police officer who took the call was like, well, it's going to take us a little bit of time to get that kind of money together, because he didn't know that this family had just won the lottery. He had no idea because they literally just walked in the door when this phone call came in. And so he was like, it's going to take us time to do that. And the kidnapper was like, I'll call you back at 5 p.m. And then he just hung up. So they were just still kind of at a loss. Like, this guy wanted the money, but he didn't tell him how to give the money to him. And so they were like, okay, well, I guess we just wait to see what happens. So 5 p.m. that night came and went with no word from the kidnapper. And
Oh no.
obviously, the family and police are freaking out. And around 7:40, not 7, 9:47 p.m., like 5 hours after this kidnapper was supposed to call, he finally calls back for the second time.
I'm not gonna lie, in that time period between 5 and 10 p.m. when there's nothing heard, I would probably also have to be sedated because I can imagine that if I was a mom and my child was for ransom somewhere and supposedly was going to be murdered, I too would probably be panicking full out.
Oh,
Sedation
yeah.
probably would have been nice, honestly. Just knock me out. I don't have to worry about
Just
it for a couple
put
hours.
me down for a little while so I don't have to think about this. Yeah, no, I feel like those 5 hours would be the longest 5 hours of your entire life. Just like waiting and hoping that you get another call about your son. That would be super traumatizing. But when the kidnapper called a second time, a police officer answered the phone again. It was a different police officer than the first one. And this police officer, his job was to try and stall the kidnapper as long as possible so that they could get a trace on the call. And so he was doing his best, and the kidnapper was like telling them like what to do with the money. Basically, he was like, put it in two different paper bags, and he was like in the middle of a sentence, and then all of a sudden he just stopped talking and he hung up without giving any further instructions. And so the police weren't able to get a trace, and the kidnapper never called back again. That was his
Do
last
you
communication
think?
with the family.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's terrible. Do you think he, like, in the middle of the call realized they're probably tracing me? I'm gonna hang up now.
It kind of seems like that, yeah. It kind of seems like he was mid call and he's like, this is probably a police officer and I'm going to get caught. So he just gave up the game. He was like, I'm done. I'm not going to risk it.
Well, the worst part is it's like any any decent to just below decent person at this point would just release the kid and like take off, you know? But as you've told us, it's not how that story's gonna end, which real bummer.
Unfortunately, not.
But it's like what at that point would possess him to like do what he does? He's not gonna
Exactly.
get his
Like,
money. He didn't tell them how to do that.
no, they don't know who he is. They have no way to get the money to him, even if they wanted to. He just,
Why would they
like,
like he just screwed his only chance? That just doesn't make sense. At least call
no, it really
back like an
doesn't.
hour later and just give him like a one sentence instruction there, then he could get his money. Doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so they obviously they didn't know that was going to be his last call, so they were still waiting for more communication from the kidnapper. And at the very beginning of this, when Graham was first reported missing that morning, they had immediately like started searching to try and find him. And so their initial search was actually focused in the area around the Thorne residence, obviously, because that's where he disappeared from. But there was literally like nothing. They couldn't find any like trace of what could have happened to him. And the police canvassed the area. They talked to like everybody in the neighborhood, anybody who would have been in the area, any potential witnesses. They tracked everybody down that they could. And there was like literally like nothing. He just like vanished and nobody had even noticed or seen anything weird. And so that day, the day of the kidnapping, somebody somewhere leaked the story to the media. And the Sydney Daily Mirror was the first to like report on this kidnapping. And like I said, this was the first time this had ever happened. And so the story spread like wildfire. Like everybody immediately knew about this and like wanted not wanted to be involved, but wanted to help, I guess. And so immediately police were like overwhelmed with tips. Like they were getting hundreds of phone calls a day about where Graham could have been, potential sightings of him. So it was like good in some ways because police had lots of information, but they also had too much information and they had to find a way to sort through it. And so the day of the kidnapping, after the story was leaked for the first time, the police commissioner actually made a public appeal for information and for Graham to be returned to his family. And then he let Basil, Graham's father, who he'd come back as soon as he'd heard what was going on and that his son had been kidnapped. He got on the air and he like pled that his son be returned, quote unquote, in one piece. So he was just like begging for this kidnapper to just let them go. And the police thought that maybe he would just like leave the kid somewhere, that the kidnapper would be like, there's too much heat on this right now. I'm just going to leave him somewhere. But they still couldn't find him. And so police who were assigned to this investigation, they literally spent like upwards of 17 hours at a time before taking breaks. They were just constantly on duty. Everybody, like every police officer, their leave was canceled. like everybody was called back to like come and help search for this kid. And television stations were posting pictures of him and descriptions of him and encouraging people to call the police if they knew anything, which is probably why they got so many. They got, on one of the days, they got like 400 phone calls in one day.
Gee, that's a ton of freaking phone calls. It's insane. Do you think that this, like, all this heat that they put on by publishing out in the news and stuff, do you think that's like what almost spurred the murder instead of like just it being a kidnapping? Do you think all of a sudden they were worried they weren't going to get away with it because everybody's eyes were on them? You know what I mean?
I think it's a possibility. I'll get more into what happened a little bit later, but I think it's a possibility. I think that because this blew up and I think the kidnapper had no idea that this would get so much attention. I think it freaked him out and potentially caused him to harm Graeme. But I'm not sure because the story that the kidnapper tells and the story that the police think is true are two very different things.
Okay.
So we'll get into it. But also, another negative side effect of all this media coverage was that people are jerks. And there were a bunch of prank callers who called the Thorne household. And some of them pretended to be their son, like pretended to be Graeme,
Oh my gosh.
which is
That is
horrible.
messed up.
Yeah, right? Some of them pretended to be the kidnapper and were like demanding things. Some of them were just your regular trash people and they were just tormenting the family with just basically mocking them because of their situation, which is not okay. It's like trolls before the internet. It's like real
Yeah.
life people just being garbage. And so, anyways, it was just like a hailstorm of just like garbage and so much media coverage that you'd think it would be a good thing, but it kind of turned out to not be a good thing. And the day after Graeme's disappearance, they started searching in different areas around Sydney and they focused on the northeastern suburbs. And they ended up finding Graeme's school case with his name inscribed on it, but not him. They just found his school
Oh,
case. And
it's not a
so,
good sign.
not a good sign. And that same day, police also got a tip that a boy who was matching Graeme's description was seen leaving the Pennant Hills area with two men and a woman. So the owners of the gas station that was in that area, they actually saw this same group of people come into their gas station and they were in like a dark colored car and it was like 10 p.m. the day that Graeme disappeared. So like 13 minutes after the phone call that they received that first day. And so the car was missing the front license plate. In Australia, they
Okay.
call that a number plate, but I'm going to call it a license plate because I'll never remember to say that every time. But it's a number
It's a
plate, a
license
license
plate.
plate.
Okay.
So they were missing the front license plate and they had the back license plate. And so when the car pulled away, the gas station owner, he like wrote down that number. He remembered it. And so he gave it to police
Good for
because
him.
yeah, so that's one good thing about the fact that there's so many eyes on this and that everybody wants to be involved in it is that they do get some good tips. Like most of this case is because people were paying attention and they gave good tips to police. But it's also like there were negative side effects as well. So they were able to like they put a bolo out or whatever for this license plate number. They ran the license plate number and found that it was not for that car, so it was a stolen license plate and it was not registered to the vehicle that was like attached to that license plate. So they assumed it was a stolen vehicle based on that information. And so they were thinking this was like a pretty good lead, you know, like stolen car, potentially stolen kid. And a police officer, like an off duty police officer, he saw this car with that same license plate, missing the front license plate. and he like went to approach the vehicle and it sped off and like basically ran away from him. And so they were like, it's looking pretty good that like these people are involved in what happened. Um, this also caught police attention because they were kind of operating under the idea that potentially there was more than one person involved in the kidnapping. They thought that maybe like a woman was involved because of how easily like and organized this was. It seemed like a woman would be able to lure him into a car or something more easily than a man would, you know? So they were just kind of
Interesting, yeah.
thinking that maybe like it was a group of people because of how smoothly this seemed to go. There was like like nobody noticed anything. So they kind of thought it was too organized and well thought out to just be like one person.
Well, it
And
seems
so
weird to
that
me, like going back to witnesses and stuff. Like he's at a bus stop, and typically at a bus stop, there's like at least multiple kids, if not like parents. But I guess he
it's
hadn't
not
made
a
it to
bus
the bus
stop.
stop yet.
It's not a bus
Oh,
stop.
that's
It's
true.
just a
You're right
corner.
because it's just a corner where he gets picked up by a friend.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's true. I was thinking in my
So
mind that was
like
a
it's
bus stop,
still
and I was like, how is there no
yeah.
witnesses?
How is there nobody?
Okay.
And people definitely were there. They were around, which is why police thought like there's no way that this was like a super obvious person. Like people wouldn't think twice about
Right.
a kid getting into some woman's car, you know? Like they wouldn't think about that. They might think about it a little more if it was a man, like kind of a stranger to the neighborhood, you know? But
Yeah.
if it was a woman, they probably wouldn't think twice about it, which is why they thought a woman might be involved. But basically like nothing seemed out of the ordinary. So they thought that this wasn't just like a spur of the moment thing. They thought that it had been planned in advance. And they thought it was maybe multiple people involved because they thought maybe a woman was involved in getting him and then a man called, so they thought there might be two people or three people or whatever. So that's why this group of people that was reported multiple times kind of caught their attention because they were seen with a kid fitting Graham's description the day he disappeared, and they were being suspicious as
Yeah.
heck.
Okay.
So that was, and they also thought that the kidnapper was a foreigner because of his accent on the phone. They were like, he spoke with an accent, and kidnapping isn't like a huge thing in Australia. It's not something that happens a lot. So they thought maybe he was a foreigner. That was just kind of their reasoning. So on July 11th, which was 4 days after Graeme disappeared, police found the contents of Graham's school case, not him, but they found what was inside of his school case, and they found his school cap. So they're just like finding things that were on him when he disappeared, just like scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
And that same day, a 5,000 pound reward was offered to the public for finding Graeme, and a 15,000 pound reward was offered by two newspapers for the same thing. So there were like two money rewards going to try and get information about Graeme. And at this point, police had been investigating long enough to kind of have put some things together. They'd canvassed and interviewed enough people to like realize a couple things that were in common. They knew that there was a man who had been seen multiple times by different witnesses in the park that was opposite the Thornes' home. So multiple people had taken note of a man kind of standing in the park watching the Thorne residence. And they also noticed that at 8:20 a.m., the morning of Graham's disappearance, multiple people saw an iridescent blue 1955 Custom Line. I don't know what kind of car that is because I don't know 1955 cars. But it was like, it seemed like it was a pretty standing
Sounds
out sort of
fancy.
car. Yeah. The iridescent blue thing, it gets repeated a lot in all of my sources. So that seems to be like a sticking point. It's like this iridescent blue color. It's really shiny, which I don't know if that was weird
Okay.
back then, maybe, but it gets
Might
repeated
have
a lot.
been.
But they saw this car double parked on the corner of Francis and Wellington, which was near where Graham was actually kidnapped from, but it was like a block away. And he was like double parked, like he was like waiting to leave for something. So everybody, like a lot of witnesses in the area were like, we all saw the same car driven by some man around the time that Graham disappeared.
Was that like an is this like an area where like everybody knows everybody and they're able to like be like that's not a familiar face? Or is this like a pretty big area where people are like he could be living around here? I don't know.
I think it's a mixture of both because it is like, I don't know this for sure. I've never been to Bondi or Sydney, Australia. But like, it's a suburb outside of Sydney. So it's not like a small town, but I think it's a small enough town where you know your neighbors and you know the people on your block. And so if there's
Okay.
somebody around that you don't really recognize, you might take note. But it wouldn't be that weird to see somebody that you don't recognize either. Like it's not
Hmm.
like a super isolated area. They probably get a lot of people around that they don't know super well because they're so close to
Okay.
the city. But I'm not sure because I don't actually know anything about that area, so I could be totally wrong. I have no clue. But police, now that they had this lead about the car, this iridescent blue 1955 car, they immediately started checking registrations for that car. Like, there were over 270,000 registered 1955 Ford custom line cars.
That are
So
also
they,
iridescent blue.
yep, apparently not really iridescent blue,
So
but they went through 270,000 registration records by hand
oh my gosh.
to
Holy
weed
cow.
out which vehicles matched the descriptions and which ones didn't. And they found that there were 5,000 cars that matched the description they'd been given. So they had to
Oh
like literally
no.
go page
That's
by
a lot.
page through this. This is what happens when you don't have digitized records, man. It's 1960. There's nothing. So they had to like hand sort all of these records and they came up with a pile of 5,000 cars. And so instead of being daunted by that task, I would have been like, this is not worth it. This is not going to get us anywhere. This was the only lead they had. And so they started interviewing anybody, everybody in that list of 5,000 vehicles. And they
Dang.
started just like interviewing the owners and seeing which ones actually matched the description that they were given. And they actually, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but they actually potentially interviewed the kidnapper on August 24th about his car. I only saw
And
in
that
one
was
source.
like yeah. How long, sorry, is August 24th after the kidnapping?
So it's like 6 weeks after.
That's what I
August
thought. I was like,
24th
that's
is
not
like,
close.
no,
And he's still missing, no sign of him.
he's still missing, no
Potentially
trace.
they talked to the kidnapper.
Yes.
Okay.
So 6 weeks into this investigation, the only lead they have is this car. That's it. And so they're just interviewing owner after owner after owner of this car. And I'm not sure if they actually like interviewed the kidnapper or not. I saw one article that said that they did, and obviously the kidnapper denied being in the area. But they were operating under the assumption that the car was stolen, and so they were kind of looking for people whose
Oh,
cars had been stolen
yeah, right.
specifically. While all that's happening simultaneously, August 24th, whatever, if you go back about a week on August 16th, this is when everybody's worst fears were confirmed. There were a couple of local kids who they had seen this blue picnic blanket like wrapped around something that was like sitting on this vacant lot in their neighborhood, and they'd noticed it for weeks, but they didn't really know its import. But one of the kids happened to mention it to their parents, and the parents were immediately like, that's not good. And they called police on August 16th. And police came, and what they found was Graham's body. Graham had
Oh.
been wrapped in a blue tartan picnic blanket, and his arms and legs were tied with string, and he was gagged with a scarf, and he was still wearing his gray school uniform that he'd gone missing in.
Oh, it breaks my
And
heart.
yeah, so it was like not the news that they wanted to get, but probably the news that they assumed they'd get after 6 weeks of searching for him, which was just horrible. And the day after they found him, his father had to go to the city morgue and identify him and make sure that it was actually him, which I just can't even imagine. That seems
No, that's
so
terrible.
traumatizing. But this case is also really unique because it's one of the first cases in Australia where forensics were like really, really used to figure out what happened and figure out who killed Graham. So forensics were kind of new back in 1960. They weren't super well developed, if you will. And so what they did was they basically examined evidence from the scene, and police found that the blanket that Graham was wrapped in had been manufactured in South Australia between June 6, 1955 and January 19th, 1965. And so that didn't really get any leads, but they were hoping
I'm
that
like,
they'd find
that tells
something.
them nothing.
Doesn't tell them anything. But what they found on the blanket itself actually ended up being very helpful. They found traces of two types of trees, the smooth cypress tree, and I can't say this, but I'm going to try, the Squarosa false cypress. So there were two types of cypress trees that were like traces of those trees were found on the blanket, and those trees were not found on the lot where they found Graham's body. So they assumed
Okay.
that his body had been moved to that location after being somewhere else.
Were
And
they
so
common trees?
they were not commonly found together. It was weird to see these two types of trees in the same place. So they weren't
Hmm.
like super uncommon, but it was weird to see them like in the same yard, say. So that kind of gave them something to go off of. And they also found dog hairs from a Pekingese dog on the blanket. And they
Oh,
found a blonde human hair on the blanket. So they kind of
there
had
they
this
go.
weird, these weird
A
little
little
pieces of
picture.
information. Yep. And after Graham's body was discovered, they did like a thorough examination of his body, and forensics were able to kind of tell them the time frame for his death. So, based on his remains and what they found in his stomach contents, and there was some fungus that they took from his shoes and fly larva activity. Like they went full bones on this. They were like, we're
Yeah,
gonna
they're not
figure
cutting
this out.
corners. They're like, which I
Yep.
guess if this is
I
like the first case of its kind, they're probably pretty amped up about it. They're probably like,
yeah.
this is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah,
This
devoting
person is
like
not
all the
getting away with
resources they
this.
have. Yep.
Yeah.
And like immediately I was like seeing a Bones episode in my mind when I like was like listening to this case. But so they found that based on all of that information and all that sciencey stuff, they believed that Graham had been killed within 24 hours of being kidnapped, and they believed that he had also been like his body had been moved and dumped in that field within 24 hours as well. They didn't
So I'd
think
been there
he'd
forever.
been yeah, he'd been there literally since the beginning of
Weeks.
their searches.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. I
And
bet that guy thought
so
he was getting away with it too.
yeah, I mean, there was no, like he like immediately got rid of Graham as soon as he could, and then there was nothing for weeks. And so they also found soil on his body as well as pink limestone mortar fragments, which told the police that they believed his body had been like kept underneath a house for a certain, like, a little bit of time before it had
Oh,
been moved. So
okay.
they actually got like a lot of information from like the
Yeah.
forensics in this case.
Somebody did a good
They
job.
Yeah. So at this point, the police had a picture of what they were looking for. They were looking for a house with a blue car, with pink mortar brick, and two specific types of cypress trees in the front yard. They were
And a
like,
dog.
and a dog, a Pekingese dog, and a person with blonde hair.
There you
They
go.
were
They got a
like,
lot.
yeah, that's kind of a lot to go. I mean, it's kind of hard to narrow that down by yourself,
Unless you walk
but
the
they,
streets, but
yep, you just walk back and forth till you find the right house. But they didn't have to do that because they released all this information to the public, and they were like, where
oh.
is this house? And a postman, nice, a hero, if you will, of mail, he he was in the Clontarf area. I think I said that right. I looked up the pronunciation. Yeah. He was in the Clontarf area, and he tipped police off about a house that fit that description that was in his route. He was like, I
Oh.
walk by that house every day.
He's
And
on the
so
ball.
he was on the ball. And so police immediately, like, they looked into the tip, and they found that the house that this postman was talking about was a house that belonged to a man named Stephen Bradley. And Stephen was a Hungarian immigrant who was born Istvan Barane in
So they were
1926,
right.
and
He
he
was
was from
not
Budapest.
Australian.
He was not Australian. And in like 1950, like 10 years before the abduction, he'd moved to Australia, and he'd had two wives while he was in Australia. His first wife had died in a car accident, leaving him with like their daughter, and then he'd remarried a woman who had two of her own children. So at the time of the kidnapping, they'd had three children living in their house. So he was a father of three, and he was married.
My gosh.
Yeah.
And he
And so
decided it was
police
a good idea
obviously,
to kidnap and murder somebody
oh
else's
yeah,
child. This is what always
apparently.
mind boggles me is when like people have children and they do things like this to other people.
I know. It's
Where are the
insane.
missing links there? Like what is happening?
What
Do they
causes
never
you
think
to
to
think that
themselves,
you can do
what would
that?
happen if somebody kidnapped my child for
Yeah.
ransom and murdered
How
them?
would
Like,
I
no,
feel?
maybe they just don't care. Maybe they're like, yeah,
They
that would
I
suck, but it ain't me. Huh.
clearly this guy
Okay,
didn't care.
whatever.
So
Obviously.
police roll up to the Bradley home, and they're ready to arrest this guy because they're pretty sure they found their person. But the house was abandoned. There was nobody in it. And they found out that on July 7th, the day of the abduction, the Bradley family had moved out of the house. It was like a planned move. He'd timed it so that the day of the kidnapping, he was leaving the house.
Oh my gosh.
So they'd actually moved into a rental apartment in Sydney. And then on September 26th, which was again like
It's like 2 months
almost, it
later.
was like 5 weeks after they found Graham's body, 5 weeks after that, they left the country because they were moving to England. So on September
Oh my
26th,
gosh.
Bradley put his family in a boat called the SS Himalaya and then set off across the deep blue ocean.
The deep blue sea.
And because of this, they left on September 26th, right? And so they were going to be on the ship for weeks because they were traveling all the way to England, right? And they were stopping in Sri Lanka, and traveling by boat is really slow. Sri Lanka it's in Asia. I looked it up. It's like the southeastern part of Asia. I don't really know
Okay.
how to describe that. But the boat was going to dock there on October 10th. So it was like 2 weeks later after they left. So police they caught wind of this whole situation, and they were like, as soon as they found their man, they figured out that he was on this boat and he wasn't going to be. They still had a week because he was still in the middle of the ocean. They were like, it was like October 2nd when they figured this all out. And they were like, we can't get to him, but we need to be waiting for him in Sri Lanka when that ship docks. So
Yeah, that's
while they
right.
were basically just like
Nail that
waiting to
sucker.
arrest him, yeah, nail him to the wall, they just started putting pieces together. They started interviewing people about him, going back to witnesses, going back to the Thorns to see if like they'd ever met him before. And so they found that Bradley had basically planned this out like to a T. He'd spent like a week just like meticulously watching this family, getting their routine down. Like they confirmed with witnesses that this was the man that they'd seen watching the Thorne residence from the park across the street. And they also showed the picture to Freda Thorne and also to the Thorne's neighbor, Mrs. Lord. And Freda told them, like, I have seen that man before. And she told them a story about how she'd met this man. He had knocked on her door on June 14th.
You're kidding
And
me.
he had, yeah, because he was trying to confirm the address and make sure that he'd gotten the right house. So he knocked on the door, and when Freda answered, he asked her using a thick accent if there was a Mr. Bognor home. And she was like, nobody by that name lives here. And he was like, are you sure? I'm a private investigator. I've been asked to check on Mr. Bognor. And he acted super confused that he thought he was in the right place or whatever. And he took out a piece of paper and confirmed the address and phone number that like of their residence. And she was like, yes, that's right, but nobody named Bognor lives here. And so he was like, okay, maybe he was a previous resident. And Frida was like, why don't you go talk to the neighbors? They've been here longer than us. We haven't lived here for that long. So why don't you go ask them? Maybe they'll know something about who you're looking for. So then he did that. He went upstairs, knocked on the door of her neighbor, talked to Mrs. Lord and asked her the same thing, and then left.
I
But
guess
this
he
was
thought
all
he was
just
like
like,
being sly. He was like, yeah, I'm gonna cover my tracks. I'm gonna make it really look like my lie is true. That's dumb. Also, like, you may have confirmed an address, but the address is on the freaking house. Unless I'm
yeah,
crazy.
no, I
And
mean,
you
I
didn't
think that's
confirm
how it
who lived
works.
there.
Yeah, you didn't ask her what her name was. Like, that's just weird. It's just weird. I mean,
Dumb.
I just don't
Okay.
get it. He's stupid. But the one thing that was weird to Freda was that their phone number was unlisted. He shouldn't have been able to have it. Like that was one thing that like no like unless they gave it to him, he shouldn't have had it. And so she was
Yeah.
very like kind of concerned that this random man had their phone number.
Like, that
But
wasn't published, like, with the lottery
no.
stuff, right? I mean,
No,
that's not even
just their
relevant.
address was. Yeah.
Okay.
So later police would find out that he had just called the telephone exchange and asked for their number and he'd been given it without any further questions.
What are these people doing?
Too
What?
trusting. They're too
Oh my
trusting.
gosh. Okay.
So, yeah. Anyways, so he like literally he just went through that whole ruse with being the private investigator or whatever just to like confirm the phone number basically because he already had the address. He just wanted to make sure that he had the right phone number. And so I guess that was the best thing he could think of to do that. I don't know. So dumb. Anyways, so police were kind of like still investigating the Bradley home, whatever, and they were able to like link Bradley's house to Graham's body because the Bradley house had two trees on either side of the garage. One was the they were both the types of tree they were looking for, the two types of
The
cypress trees.
cypress trees. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
So that's That's great. The house was made from pink mortar with dark brick. And they found out that Bradley had owned a Pekingese dog, and they had surrendered it when they decided to move. So they didn't have it anymore, but they had owned it at one point. They also found that his blue car, because he'd gotten rid of it, but they found it and they searched it. And in the back of the car, in the trunk where Graeme was potentially kept, they found a dog brush with Pekingese dog hair in it. And they also found that Bradley's wife was a dyed blonde, and the hair matched the hair that they'd found on the blanket that Graham's
There you
body was
go.
wrapped in. So they'd basically confirmed that Bradley was responsible for it. Also, police found a roll of film that hadn't been developed and it had been thrown out. And on that film, the youngest Bradley child was sitting on the blue picnic blanket that they'd found wrapped around Graham's body.
Gee, it's
So
like
they had,
dominoes falling into
yep,
place.
they just had everything they needed. Everything they needed. And so on October 10th, when the SS Himalaya docked in Colombo, Sri Lanka, two Sydney policemen were waiting for Stephen Bradley, and they arrested him. It took them 5 weeks of like legal back and forth to get him extradited and sent back to Australia. And on November 18th, 1960, on November 18th, 1960, they got on a flight back to Australia. And supposedly, on that flight, Stephen Bradley confessed. But his story was a little different than the story that police thought.
Do criminals get like private airplanes? I
I
mean, they
don't
can't just
know.
stuff
I
them
don't think
on like a
so.
freaking public airplane though. Can you imagine?
I think
Like,
they do.
do they really? That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Or maybe that's
I
just the
mean, it
movies.
makes
I've seen
sense,
like a million movies
but
where they have like police escorts and then they have like handcuffs and then their handcuffs are covered by jackets so people don't freak out. I have no idea if that's real life, but that's what I've seen in movies.
great. Well, I'm gonna check
So I
everybody
have no
out next
idea.
time I'm on a plane.
Yep.
Whatever.
Be looking
Okay.
around to see anybody who's covering their hands. Be like, and they're with people that look like they could be undercover cops or something.
Okay.
I'll be keeping an eye out for that. But when they'd first discovered Graham's body, they had done like an examination. And during that examination, they had found that he had basically sustained skull fracturing and had like some extreme bruises. And that
Okay.
he had probably died of a combination of that skull fracture and of asphyxiation.
Oh
So that
wow.
was his cause of death. But Stephen Bradley, he told a different story about what happened. From Stephen's own mouth, this is what he says happened. He says that when he got news that Basil Thorne had won the lottery, he immediately started like hatching this plan to steal or get money from Basil Thorne. So he like saw the story in the newspaper, he got the address from the newspaper, and then he started watching the family so that he could figure out their routine and figure out the best way to get money from them. And he figured that that would be Graeme because he
Okay.
was the easiest to target. And so he watched the house, he did his whole private investigator routine, going to the Thorns' home and confirming their phone number or whatever. On the day of the kidnapping, he drove from Clonturf, where he lived, and drove to Bondi. And that day, like I said, they were moving. So he sent his wife and 3 kids into Sydney to go deal with travel and all sorts of stuff for their upcoming trip, to get settled into their new apartment or whatever. And he said he was going to stay behind and deal with the movers. In Australia, they call them retrievalists, which I thought was interesting. Just a fun side
Wow.
note.
Retrievalists. Okay.
retrievalists. Anyways, but he's like, I'm gonna stay behind, deal with the movers. You take the kids. You go and do whatever else needs done. Instead of
Oh,
actually dealing
convenient.
with said retrievalists, he drove to Bondi and he saw Graeme walking down the street. He waited for him a block away. When he saw Graeme, he pulled up into the spot where Phyllis Smith usually picked him up from, and he basically just asked him if he wanted to ride to school. And Graeme said yes. And Graeme got into his car, and then Bradley drove to a nearby park called Centennial Park. And once they got there, Bradley said he forcibly tied Graham's hands and legs together with twine and put a gag in his mouth and then wrapped him in the blanket and put him in the trunk of the car. And Bradley said that he then went back to his house and parked his car at like a nearby phone box because he wanted to make a call to the
Right.
family to demand the ransom. This was
Right.
like 15 minutes later. It's 9:40. And he made the first ransom call to the Thorne house from that payphone, said his whole spiel about getting the money or feeding Graeme to the sharks. And then when he got off the phone, he went back to his home and went to the trunk of his car and found that Graeme was dead, that he'd purely died by accident. And now, instead of having a kidnapping on his hands, he had a murder on his hands. And he didn't want to stop, though, because he still wanted that 25,000 pounds. So instead of trying to like make it right or maybe stop, he like calls again at 9:47 knowing that Graeme is dead and continues to try and get ransom money and pretends that he's alive. So he said that he called at 9:47 and that when he realized it was a police officer on the other end of the line, he decided to like cancel the whole thing and to just get rid of Graham's body. And he said that he had to
Right.
keep Graham
Okay.
in the trunk of his car because the movers were actually still at his home when he got back. And so he couldn't like get rid of his body until later in the day. And as soon as the movers were gone, he drove the car to that vacant lot and got rid of Graham's body. That's what he said happened.
I honestly, I see it both ways. Like you leave a kid in a car for a certain amount of time, they're gonna suffocate. Like they're gonna run out of oxygen in a trunk. That happens. So like I could see that negligence, but I could also see I don't know. I could also see it going the opposite way and him murdering him on purpose, obviously, because he kidnapped a child. So
Yeah.
it
So
follows to
his
me that
boundaries.
he's not that torn up. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and like I would be inclined to believe him. I feel like that's like you said, that's totally plausible. If you gag a child, wrap them in a blanket, and then toss them in the trunk of your car, yeah, they're gonna asphyxiate. But if that's what happened, if he accidentally died in Bradley's trunk, explain the skull fracture to me. That was part of his cause of death. Bradley omitted any sort of injury like that from his story. And based on the patterns and the autopsy, they believe that he was hit with something, that it was blunt force
Oh,
trauma. So that's why police don't believe him, because
that's
the
interesting.
injuries on Graham's body go against that story.
I would say that I could see blunt force trauma if they thought it was like from being like your head knocked on something because I don't know, if you're trying to tie a kid up and he's fighting back and you might like push him onto the ground or something, you could bang your head on something. So if it's possible that the trauma was caused from that, his story would be believable.
Yeah. I don't know for sure. The only thing I saw was that they believe he was hit with something, but I don't know why
Yeah.
specifically. They didn't say. But for whatever reason, like they just didn't, they did not believe Bradley. And Bradley would have every reason to lie about that. So I don't know
Oh
that
yeah,
I would
yeah.
believe him
Why
either.
would he? Why would he tell the truth?
Yeah. But police believe potentially, like allegedly, they weren't able to like necessarily prove this, but police believe that Graham was potentially alive longer than Bradley said, and that when during that second call at 9:47 p.m. when he abruptly like hung up, they think that he figured out police were on the other end and decided like he couldn't keep Graham alive and he needed to like get out of town. And so he decided to murder him. That's kind of what police think happened. Either
Hmm.
way, the end result was the same. Graham died in this ridiculous, stupid plot
Scheme.
to try and get money
Yeah.
from his family. It was ridiculous because the plan just fell apart. Like it seemed so well thought out. And then as soon as he actually had Graham, like he didn't actually try and get money. Like he said he wanted money, but he
Yeah.
never told anybody how to give him money. And it just kind of fell apart. It's like he couldn't get organized after actually doing it. But he was brought back to Australia after confessing he was charged with murder, the murder of Graham and the kidnapping and abduction of Graham. And he was taken to trial and he was given a life sentence in prison. And that was basically his whole thing. He died 8 years into his sentence at the age of 42 from a heart attack in prison. And that was kind of the end of Stephen Bradley. I don't really know what
Wow.
happened like with his family. Did they just like leave them in Sri Lanka on the at the port on the boat? Like I don't know what happened, but
I would bet that that's like one of those stories where like the wife was probably completely like astounded.
shocked. Yeah.
Like he has 3 kids. I'm sure, I
Yeah.
don't know. Maybe she wasn't, but I could see it going that way where she's like, "He did what now?" And
Excuse why are you
disowning
arresting my
him and
husband?
yeah,
Oh yeah.
exactly.
I think
So,
that's probably what happened. I don't know if it was an accident or not. I honestly could see it either way. I think the evidence like it could go either way. But
yeah.
I do think that Stephen Bradley didn't care at all what happened either way because he had
No.
no care at all. He kidnapped this child off the streets of a neighborhood. He'd been
Yeah.
watching this family. He went like there was so much premeditation with this kidnapping. And
Yeah. And like he called and said that he had the intent of, that's what you do on a ransom call, but
yeah.
said that he had the intent of murdering him
Yeah, he was
if
like I'll
things didn't
kill
go
him
his
if you don't
way.
give me what I want. Yeah. And so
So
whether it was an
I
accident or
could
not, it's still murder.
I agree. I could see it both ways. I could also see him hitting him with a blunt force object at some point to try and like debilitate him or knock him out or something. And he left that out when telling the police because that makes him seem like a far worse
Worse.
person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I see it going both ways, but it's entirely possible that he meant to kill him and he was done. He didn't want to have to deal with it. But what's so sad about this is it's like he was escaping anyway. Like if he had just released him and taken off to another country, like chances are he probably never would have gotten caught. I mean, without that
Oh
blanket,
yeah.
like being found on his body and stuff, like I doubt that they would have ever been able to completely track him down. And
Yeah, no.
so part of me does tend to believe that it was an accident because why, when you're about to flee the country, would you do that intense thing of murdering somebody?
Yeah.
Like
It
you're
almost
gonna be
seems
gone
like
anyway.
exactly because he had this whole thing planned out. Like he had it so meticulously thought out that like he knew exactly when he was going to be moving. He had literally moved out of the house so that there was no like basically no trace of him. There was no way to like find him. And it seems like Graham's death kind of put a wrench in his plans. Like, it kind of messed up his momentum and he didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
So I feel like I kind of believe that it might have been an accident.
I
Does
also
that?
believe that when push came to shove, he probably would have killed him anyway, though.
Yeah,
So
I think
either
that if
way,
it like had come to
he is a
that,
murderer. He is a terrible person.
yeah,
So,
definitely.
but
And yeah, so
that's terrible. The
that's a terrible story.
poor family, Graham's poor family was probably like, would give anything to go back and not win the lottery.
Yeah,
I'm sure they would
literally.
trade everything that all the money they got just to save their family, their son. But
Yeah, that's actually what Freda Thorne said in one of her not police, media interviews. She said, "I'll give him all of it if he returns our son to us. Like, he can have whatever
it's
he wants. I
terrible.
just want Graham back." And it's just horrible because Graham had been dead the whole time. It just like makes your stomach sink a little bit. Everybody was trying to find him and he was already gone.
Wow.
But yeah, so that's
Yeah,
the
that's
story of the kidnapping and murder of Graeme Thorne and the first
it's a
ever
terrible one.
child kidnapping for ransom in the history of Australia. It's pretty
Well,
crazy.
I'm glad he got caught.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad that they found him. I would have been super disappointed if they didn't. That would suck. But a lot of the articles I read said that this was like this case, this story was like the thing that stole Australia's innocence and started like the whole stranger danger thing in Australia
Oh, that
and
really is
kind
a
of
bummer.
changed, like changed the public's kind of awareness of people like this, which is like a good thing and also a sad thing at the same time.
Yeah, it's
Like,
like they should be a little bit more aware because if they had been, it never would have happened. Like, I doubt he would have been able to pull it off at all if he couldn't have gotten the address and the phone number and the
yep,
everything information. So, but at the same time, I mean, if you can live in a country where that's not even a problem because people are generally good people, then that seems far better
yeah, for
than
sure.
having to be constantly afraid of a billion terrible people. So,
Exactly. Exactly. I agree with that. It's better to be in a community of good people than to always be worried about somebody kidnapping your children off the streets. But
yeah. Well, that was a new one for me. So,
yeah, I hadn't heard that one before.
thanks
It
for
was good.
listening, y'all. Thanks for
Yeah.
being here.
Thank you very much. We will be here next week. Hopefully you will too. But until then, follow us on social
You know what to
media.
do.
Just like always. For crying out loud underscore podcast on Instagram. We're on the Facebook. We're on the Twitter at criming out loud. We have a Gmail for crimingoutloud@gmail.com. Share us with your friends. Spread the word. We want more people listening to us. So
Yeah, and if you like us, word of mouth is great too. Tell your friends to check us out. Do it.
do it. Until next week, y'all. Bye.
Bye.